Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Soulcalibur, a weapon-based 3D fighting title developed by Project Soul and produced by Namco for arcades in 1998, with a Sega Dreamcast port following a year later in 1999, and eventually ports to the Xbox 360, iOS, and Android platforms in later years. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 147. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you. There are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Centerwall, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan, Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to give a brief overview of the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context. How was the game made? Why was the game made? And then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that. But we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Soulcalibur. Soulcalibur is a weapon-based 3D fighting title developed by Project Soul and produced by Namco for arcades in 1998, with a Sega Dreamcast port following a year later in 1999, and eventually ports to the Xbox 360, iOS, and Android platforms in later years. Before we can talk about the very three-dimensional fighter Soulcalibur, we need to take a step back and once again take a look at a few of the decidedly non-three-dimensional tournament fighting games from the early 90s, a style of game that became incredibly popular in arcades around the world, driven primarily by the competitive multiplayer nature of the genre, coupled with the high skill ceilings to master individual fighters and their various special, combo, and finishing moves, many of which were unpublished at the time, forcing players to spend quarter after quarter in the hopes of becoming more proficient at their favorite fighting game title. It was not uncommon in the early 90s to see a row of quarters lined up on individual arcade machines, each one representing an individual combatant's place in line, as players waited to take on the current reigning champion. For those who experienced it firsthand, it was truly a magical time, and for the most part, the early 90s arcade fighting game scene was dominated by two main titles, Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. Street Fighter II was the sequel to Capcom's original Street Fighter title, a tournament fighter that was originally developed and published back in 1987. The first Street Fighter was based on a concept by Takashi Nishiyama, who, after working on the influential side-scrolling beat-em-up title Kung Fu Master, had an epiphany. What if a game could essentially be a series of boss fights, rather than placing bosses at the end of a level that you had to defeat a ton of minions to reach? You could keep the same fighting gameplay, but by shifting the focus to be one-on-one encounters with powerful opponents, you might be able to ratchet the tension up and, in the process, still deliver absorbing gameplay, even though you weren't mowing down waves of bad guys. Street Fighter would end up refining, and in some cases defining, various mechanics that would continue to evolve the state of the one-on-one fighting game. The game would feature tournament-style gameplay, where the player would select from one of several different, distinct, detailed characters at the start of the game, with the intent of traveling the world and beating other characters in one-on-one melee-centric combat. Rather than model itself after a one-hit, one-point kind of mechanic, which had been the norm up to this point, Street Fighter would feature life bars for each character, taking a page out of the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre. Each character would have access to a full suite of moves and combinations, and in what would be a first for the tournament fighting genre, the game would include a series of unpublished special moves that, should the player figure out the right combination of joystick and button presses, would unleash a devastating attack that could turn the tide of battle in an instant. The key to victory was learning your character, as each character in Street Fighter was unique and had their own traits and moves to contend with. This, for all intents and purposes, was the start of the next generation of fighting titles. Capcom would follow Street Fighter with a direct sequel in 1991, Street Fighter II, though to simply call Street Fighter II a sequel would be a bit reductive, as it would represent one of the biggest leaps in quality and features ever seen when compared to an immediate predecessor. Street Fighter II would keep the foundational elements that the original title put in place, like the concept of a worldwide tournament with various characters, stages, and movesets, but it would iterate and improve upon nearly every aspect of that formula. Graphics and animations were incredibly detailed, with large, chunky sprites giving each combatant their own personality, while separate stage music, all of which was absolutely awesome, would enhance the action. Further, each character would receive a full complement of special moves and combos, which, assuming you practiced enough, would give you a leg up over the competition. Street Fighter II would prove immensely popular amongst arcade goers, and would go on to become the third highest grossing video game of all time, accumulating over $10 billion in sales over its lifetime. That is a lot of quarters. With Street Fighter II's success, a number of other companies would start to release their own fighting games, hoping to grab a piece of the proverbial fighting game pie that Street Fighter II was currently enjoying. One of those companies, and the eventual creator of a series that would directly compete against Street Fighter for years to come, was arcade game development studio Midway, who tasked two of its most creative designers, John Tobias and Ed Boon, to come up with a game that could rival Street Fighter II's success. As longtime listeners of our podcast likely recall, the game born out of that request was none other than Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat represented a very different take on the fighting game genre, with a focus on digitized actors and over-the-top violence, as opposed to Street Fighter II's more cartoon-styled visuals that, while no less violent, contained much less gore, a fact that was not lost on many politicians who declared Mortal Kombat to be a hazard to the youth of the world, a true gateway drug to causing violence in real life as opposed to the digitized blood splatter that accompanied every successful punch, uppercut, and kick in the virtual world of the game. Mortal Kombat, along with other controversial titles like Doom and Night Trap, would lead a number of countries to create video game ratings boards to help protect younger players from potentially seeing or playing something they may not have been mature enough for. And, as you might expect, the ratings worked absolutely flawlessly, as Mortal Kombat and its ilk would be 100% blocked off from younger players, and society as a whole would be all the better for it. Only that's not what happened at all, and in fact, the controversy surrounding Mortal Kombat led players young and old to want to play it more, which is a major reason why Mortal Kombat would end up competing fairly closely with Street Fighter II and its massive fighting game market share. While Mortal Kombat wouldn't be quite as successful as Street Fighter II over its lifetime, it was certainly a big deal in 1992 and 1993, where the game would maintain either first or second place in gross arcade sales for multiple months following its release, alternating certain months with another Midway classic arcade title, NBA Jam. While Mortal Kombat presented a different take on the tournament fighter in comparison to Street Fighter II, it would also prove to be immensely popular, and around this time, there were effectively two camps of players that hung out in many arcades. Some enjoyed the deeper combo system and cartoon-styled visuals of Street Fighter II, while others enjoyed the more visceral and bloodier action of Mortal Kombat, and for years following their respective releases, these two arcade titles reigned supreme in the fighting game space, both in arcades as well as on home consoles, as a result of high-quality ports that brought the arcade action home for individuals to enjoy in the comfort of their living rooms. As you might expect, the success of both Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat would inspire countless development studios to try their hand at creating their own tournament fighting titles, with some mirroring the digitized hand-to-hand, bloody fisticuffs of Mortal Kombat, while others would skew closer to the more cartoonish, less bloody, but still hand-to-hand based combat of Street Fighter II. And if you ever want to go down a particularly deep rabbit hole, spend a couple hours researching the various Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter copycats that were prevalent throughout the 90s. Some of those titles would end up carving out a respected spot of their own amongst the pantheon of 1990s era fighting titles, but the vast majority? Well, the less said about those titles, the better. Interestingly, despite the fact that Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat effectively set the standard in tournament fighting titles while inspiring a ridiculous number of clones, there were other development studios who weren't content to simply copy the same frameworks used by Capcom and Midway to churn out a half-hearted attempt at capturing a slice of the fighting game pie. No, some development studios wanted to evolve the state of the fighting game genre, even beyond what Capcom and Midway had been able to deliver up to this point. A subset of those studios, like console and arcade heavyweight Sega, would pursue the creation of 3D martial arts fighting titles like the incredibly popular Virtua Fighter, as a means of embracing the inevitable three-dimensional future that then modern technology was beginning to enable. Other companies, however, did not think that the time was right to dive into three-dimensional tournament fighter gameplay, especially when there were still high-quality and innovative two-dimensional experiences waiting to be delivered. And one such company who continued to focus on two-dimensional over three-dimensional visuals, particularly from a tournament fighting game perspective, was rival arcade and home console manufacturer and publisher SNK. SNK was formed in 1978 in response to the rapidly expanding arcade market of the 1970s, with company founder Eikichi Kawasaki declaring upon its founding that SNK was going to devote itself to the creation and release of coin-operated entertainment, a focus area that would end up defining the company throughout its entire lifetime. While SNK's primary focus would be the arcade space, it would dabble in the home console realm occasionally, most notably acting as a third-party developer for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan, as well as the Nintendo Entertainment System around the world. Throughout the 80s, SNK would split its time between creating games for Nintendo's 8-bit console ecosystem and developing dedicated arcade cabinets for arcade goers to enjoy. Though in its heart, SNK's true love was the world of arcade entertainment. Sure, the company would make a variety of games for home consoles, because that was just good business. But even more than their console efforts, SNK would constantly look for ways to deliver the most advanced and innovative arcade experiences that would hopefully wow gamers. Which is why, in 1990, SNK would redouble their efforts in the arcade space, as they introduced one of the more innovative arcade platforms the world had ever seen up to that point. That platform was, of course, the Neo Geo. The Neo Geo platform was important for several reasons, the most prominent of which was the fact that, unlike most arcade platforms of the time that relied on game-specific hardware, Neo Geo arcade cabinets would be designed to have their games be interchangeable through the use of massive cartridges, similar in concept to cartridge-based home consoles, albeit dramatically larger, and a ton more powerful. A Neo Geo arcade cabinet could be changed to a different title whenever an arcade operator wanted to switch things up, which would reduce the cost of ownership for those cabinets, while also making it easier for arcade owners to purchase the latest and greatest titles for their patrons to play, since all they had to do was buy the corresponding cartridge and pop it into a pre-existing cabinet already taking up arcade floor space. This degree of interchangeability, combined with the power of the underlying Neo Geo hardware, coupled with the fact that SNK would develop an in-home version of the Neo Geo platform that could play the same exact games as its arcade counterparts without any degradation in quality, made the Neo Geo ecosystem incredibly popular amongst the broader gaming population. While the expense of the home system would keep it out of reach for the majority of mainstream gamers, that in no way deterred arcade goers from plunking their hard-earned quarters into a variety of Neo Geo machines to enjoy some of the best arcade titles of the time. At the same time as SNK was innovating with its gaming hardware, it would also begin to innovate with its gaming software, as the company was always looking for ways to attract even more players to their arcade cabinets. And in the early 90s, there were a couple of gaming genres that really reigned supreme in the arcade space. One was, of course, the one-on-one fighting title, like we talked about a little bit earlier. But another incredibly popular gaming genre at the time was the tournament fighter's immediate ancestor, the venerable side-scrolling beat-em-up. As SNK began to brainstorm what new titles to bring to their powerful Neo Geo arcade platform, the company looked across the industry to determine what style of game would have the potential of being the most commercially viable, with early discussions focused on creating a side-scrolling, weapon-based beat-em-up, though, as the team dug a little bit deeper, they realized that beat-em-ups, while popular, were not nearly as popular as the one-on-one fighting game. So, rather than go down a potentially less lucrative path, SNK would shift its focus and decide to create an entry in the tournament fighter genre, a move that, like we discussed, a bunch of companies were doing in light of Mortal Kombat's and Street Fighter II's success. SNK, however, did not want to just copy what others had done. They wanted to innovate, similar to what they had done when they introduced one of, if not the first modular arcade platform ever made. With innovation, and of course potential sales, propelling the company forward, SNK would create one of the first weapons-based one-on-one fighting games in gaming history, as it developed and released the very first Samurai Showdown in July of 1993. Unlike other fighting titles of the time, Samurai Showdown would feature a series of different combatants who, rather than using their fists, would instead use one of a series of different weapons to fight one another, an innovative twist on the fighting game formula that would end up being incredibly influential and popular across the gaming industry. Shortly after its release, Samurai Showdown would rocket to the top of arcade sales charts, a spot it would maintain for over 4 months following its release, followed by a prolonged stay as one of the top 10 arcade games of the time. A number of ports, sequels, and spin-offs would follow, proving that, even in the post-Street Fighter/Mortal Kombat era of tournament fighters, there were still ways to innovate on what had become the quote-unquote standard fighting game formula. While SNK was innovating in the two-dimensional fighting space, other companies would take up the mantle of innovating in the three-dimensional fighting space, a style of game that, as of Samurai Showdown's release, didn't even have a standard bearer until November of 1993, which is when Sega's first Virtua Fighter would release to arcades. Virtua Fighter took the hard-hitting two-dimensional tournament fighting experience and reimagined it in 3 dimensions, with full polygonal characters and a feeling of realistic martial arts action that up to this point had been missing from the more over-the-top gameplay of most two-dimensional fighters. Virtua Fighter would usher in the era of the 3D tournament fighting game, with development studios slowly but surely starting to use 3D visuals in order to woo gamers to their arcade cabinets. The two-dimensional fighter was still the dominant style of fighting game around this time, but it was fairly obvious, given the success of Virtua Fighter, that 3D was about to make a big splash in the fighting game space. As you might imagine, a bunch of different developers were interested in jumping into a new, potentially lucrative gaming space, and now that Virtua Fighter had thrown the first punch, it wouldn't take long for other games to follow, with one of the most prominent releases around this time being Namco's Tekken, a 3D fighting title that was effectively Namco's way of telling Sega that they too could make a solid 3D tournament fighter, as long as they had help from one of Virtua Fighter's main designers. Obviously, I'm joking, because I have no doubt Namco's staff was incredibly talented in their own right, but it is true that the main designer on Tekken, a man named Seiichi Ishii, had previously worked with Sega, and had helped design Virtua Fighter a year prior to him joining Namco. Definitely some interesting ancestry there. Anyway, Tekken would be released in arcades in 1994, where it would become popular, but not necessarily a must-play cabinet. When Tekken was ported to the Sony PlayStation in 1995, though, that's when the game would grow into a legitimate blockbuster, as it became the first PlayStation title to sell over 1 million copies, a distinction that would drive Namco to continue creating games in the Tekken series, while also branching off into other types of 3D fighting titles. More on that in a little bit. Interestingly, while two-dimensional fighters had been hand-to-hand affairs for years before the first weapon-based games like Samurai Showdown made their way to market, it wouldn't take nearly as long for the first weapon-based three-dimensional fighting games to begin making waves in the industry, with the very first 3D tournament fighting game to feature weapon-based combat being Tamsoft's Battle Arena Toshinden, which skipped arcades entirely to release on the Sony PlayStation Home console at the beginning of the year in 1995. While I don't want to dive too deep into the creation of Battle Arena Toshinden today, I do think it warrants a bit of discussion, because Battle Arena Toshinden would end up being incredibly influential in the 3D fighting game space, and today I feel like the game doesn't get nearly as much attention as other fighting game franchises, like the Virtua Fighters and Tekkens of the world. Not only would Battle Arena Toshinden be one of the earliest 3D fighters in history, but it would also be the first to utilize weapon-based combat, and would also be the first 3D fighting title to feature full three-dimensional movement, with the ability for players to sidestep around the stage, meaning into and out of the screen. Virtua Fighter and Tekken featured 3D polygonal characters, sure, but all of those 3D characters ended up fighting each other on a two-dimensional plane with an occasionally rotating camera. It was 3D, but it wasn't 3D movement. Battle Arena Toshinden would change that by adding the ability to move in all directions in the three-dimensional world of the game, a feature that would quickly become the standard for 3D fighters from that point forward. Despite the fact that Battle Arena Toshinden isn't talked about as much today, it would influence future games, with Namco in particular ending up taking several cues from the title. In mid-1995, Namco had been considering branching out beyond its Tekken fighting game series, which at that point had just seen the release of Tekken 2 in arcades, and would itself become a title that was incredibly popular and successful both commercially and critically. Even though Namco could have started working on Tekken 2's inevitable sequel right away, they began to consider that perhaps the time was right to experiment with alternate 3D fighting game styles, and in particular, Namco wanted to explore the possibility of creating a weapon-based 3D fighting title, similar to Battle Arena Toshinden, but intended to be even more advanced, and hopefully, a popular weapons-based alternative to Tekken's more traditional hand-to-hand combat. With that goal in mind, brainstorming and exploration would turn into realization and eventually release, as Namco would ship the title known as Soul Edge to arcades in early 1996. Upon its arcade release, Soul Edge would garner a fair amount of attention, with many gamers becoming enamored with the smooth weapon-based gameplay and variety of characters that the game provided. So much so that the game would become one of the top-grossing arcade titles of 1996, though would ultimately not be quite as successful as Namco's other 3D fighting game series, Tekken, had become following the second title's release. Similar to when the first Tekken came out though, Soul Edge would take on a life of its own when it was ported to the Sony PlayStation system in early 1997, a port that went far beyond simply recreating the arcade experience at home. The PlayStation version of Soul Edge, which was eventually renamed to Soul Blade, would feature the same action and fluid gameplay that players enjoyed in arcades, but would marry that gameplay with a variety of new features and game modes, with perhaps the most interesting addition being Edge Master Mode, which was effectively a story mode for each of the characters in the game that would play out across 10 chapters, each of which had various battles to complete and weapons to unlock. Edge Master Mode added an entirely new style of gameplay to the fighting game genre, and was a main reason why Soul Edge on the PS1 would receive both stellar critical reviews and become a sizable commercial hit, with almost 1 million copies sold shortly after its release. Between Soul Edge's success in both arcades and the PlayStation, it's likely not a surprise that Namco would want to capitalize on that success by creating a sequel that would, hopefully, eclipse the original title in terms of both quality and sales. The thing is though, Namco didn't just want to create a sequel to serve as an evolved form of the first game. They wanted to create an entirely new, advanced experience, one that would exist in the same universe as the original title, but would be such a dramatic leap in quality that simply affixing a 2 to the end of Soul Edge and calling it a day would be a disservice to the game the team wanted to create. In fact, during the earliest stages of brainstorming, the team was even considering dropping nearly every character from Soul Edge's roster in favor of a brand new set of characters for players to select from, an idea that would ultimately be rejected, but did demonstrate just how far Namco was willing to go in order to distinguish Soul Edge's eventual sequel from its predecessor. While the majority of characters from Soul Edge would eventually end up returning for its sequel, the majority of the gameplay and overall feel of the game would get a complete overhaul, with perhaps the most important and influential new gameplay mechanic being the inclusion of what Namco called an 8-way run system. While Namco was prototyping ideas for this new game, the team created a very simple demo featuring a character standing in a 3-dimensional field, with the character being able to move in literally any direction in the 3D world. Unlike the somewhat limited into and out of scene sidestepping introduced by Battle Arena Toshinden, this form of 3D movement was truly freeing, with the ability to move anywhere, a feature that had never been attempted in a 3D fighting game before. The team at Namco thought that this style of movement was so good, in fact, that they decided to literally build Soul Edge's sequel entirely around the mechanic, with everything else being added to this foundational feature as the team would continue to work on the game that would eventually come to be known as Soulcalibur. During Soulcalibur's development, the team at Namco truly did want to create a game dramatically better than Soul Edge, and even beyond that, wanted to create one of the best fighting games in the history of the genre. In order to help accomplish this seemingly challenging feat, the team would end up researching all of the different fighting games that had been released to date, including Soul Edge, in an effort to understand what made certain games fun, and what caused other games to be less than stellar experiences. The team even made it a point to collaborate with fellow Namco designers working on Tekken 3, which was in development at the same time as Soulcalibur, and the two groups would regularly exchange ideas and share best practices amongst each other, all in the hopes of improving their respective games. One of the biggest challenges facing the Soulcalibur team was the fact that as a weapons-based fighting title, extra care had to be taken in order to balance the various fighters with each other. In a game like Tekken 3, as an example, the fighting was based on hand-to-hand combat, and while I would never suggest that it's easy to balance any fighting game while still allowing each character to feel unique and powerful in their own right, it's certainly easier to balance a hand-to-hand fighting game than it is a weapon-based title. To give an example of why that might be, think about the concept of character distance. In a hand-to-hand fighting game, the distance between two characters is typically fairly consistent, meaning one fighter doesn't have a unique advantage over another, short of some having a bit of a longer reach. But for the most part, The difference in reach between two people is fairly negligible, at least within the world of digital video games. Weapons-based combat, on the other hand, can result in dramatically different attack distances, like say if you're controlling a character who uses a staff versus a character who uses a dagger. Trying to figure out how to make a dagger-based character feel powerful enough to take on a staff-wielding opponent represents a whole new set of balancing challenges, and that's not even to mention the fact that different weapons might have different attributes that could affect balancing even more. Getting the balance for Soulcalibur just right would prove to be difficult, but it was something the team at Namco believed they needed to devote attention to, if they were truly going to make, in their words, the greatest weapon-based fighting action game in the world. Eventually, work on Soulcalibur would complete, and the game would release in arcades around the world in 1998. Upon its release, the game would be met with critical acclaim and commercial success, and shortly after the arcade title made its way to market, the team behind the game would dedicate themselves to working on the home port of the title, which was slated to release on the Sega Dreamcast console the following year, and would act as a day one title for both the North American and European Dreamcast launches. Now, given the level of quality that the arcade version of Soulcalibur exhibited, you might assume that the team at Namco would simply take the arcade version of the game, recode it to work on a Dreamcast, and then slap the game onto a disc, content that they had faithfully brought Soulcalibur's arcade action into the comfort of players' living rooms. Only here, you would be absolutely wrong. Similar to the home release of Soul Edge, the Dreamcast port of Soulcalibur would end up having a number of additions made to the game, including an exclusive playable character, a number of new game modes, various unlockable features, artwork, and costumes, and, perhaps most impressively, graphics that exceeded the arcade original, which, by the way, was one of, if not the first time that a ported arcade game looked and played better at home than in the arcades. The team at Namco dedicated themselves to making the Dreamcast port the definitive Soulcalibur experience. The only question was, would those efforts end up being rewarded? The short answer to that question is yes, they would, as Soulcalibur for the Dreamcast would receive universal, and I mean universal critical acclaim, while also selling over 1.3 million copies and becoming the second best-selling game on the Dreamcast, behind only Sega's own Sonic Adventure. The degree of praise for Soulcalibur was unlike almost any game that had been released, with countless publications and critics declaring the game to be one of the best fighting games of all time, while also being recognized as one of the best games of all time, period, regardless of genre. To put it into perspective, Soulcalibur would end up getting a ton of perfect ratings from various review sites, including only the second perfect review score from legendary Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu in history, with the first being another landmark release in video game history, that being The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. For what it's worth, Ocarina of Time is still, even today, considered to be the best reviewed game in video game history, at least according to review aggregation websites. Soulcalibur would have to settle for a bit of a lower ranking, as it currently sits as the 7th best reviewed game of all time, as well as being the top reviewed fighting game in history. Not quite Ocarina of Time levels of critical love, but certainly not too shabby itself. In the years following Soulcalibur's release, it would eventually be ported to the Xbox 360 as part of the Xbox Live Arcade platform, as well as mobile platforms like iOS and Android, though as of this recording, none of those ports remain available for purchase, and all of them were, incidentally, somewhat less full-featured than the Dreamcast version of the title. Which means, if you want to play the definitive version of the game, the Sega Dreamcast is the place to do it. Soulcalibur's success would drive Namco to create a number of sequels and spin-offs over the years, with the latest iteration in the series being Soulcalibur 6, which released on modern gaming platforms back in 2018, and helped the Soulcalibur series reach over 17 million copies sold across the entirety of the franchise, a figure that has cemented Soulcalibur as one of the most beloved played fighting game franchises in the world. It's currently unclear what Namco's plans are for the future of the series, but I know I, for one, can't wait to re-enter the world of Soulcalibur at some point, hopefully in the near future. That being said, nobody knows what the future may hold. But regardless, even if the Soulcalibur series never sees another release, that in no way diminishes the quality, accomplishment, and importance of the very first Soulcalibur title. In the eyes of many, Soulcalibur allowed Namco to accomplish their goal of creating the greatest weapon-based fighting action game in the world, and even today, the Dreamcast version of Soulcalibur is considered by many to be one of the best games ever created. For fighting game aficionados, Soulcalibur remains a timeless and transcendent entry in their much-beloved genre, and as such is definitely a title that countless fans will love and remember forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Soulcalibur today versus when it was released over 25 years ago. Soulcalibur, at its core, is a 3D one-on-one fighting game, conceptually similar to countless other 3D tournament fighters like Virtua Fighter, Tekken, Dead or Alive, certain iterations of Mortal Kombat, Battle Arena Toshinden, and a bunch of other games and series that I'm likely not thinking about right now. Soulcalibur, like those other titles, allows you to select a unique fighter from a collection of potential combatants, each of whom have their own attributes and movesets, and then take that selected fighter through a series of fights to determine who is the best fighter of all, the person worthy of wielding the legendary weapon, Soul Edge. Taken at face value, that description sounds like a pretty standard one-on-one fighting game, and if you've never had the pleasure of playing Soulcalibur, you'd be excused for thinking that there's nothing particularly special about the game. That assumption, however, is entirely invalid, because Soulcalibur is most certainly much more than that description would suggest, and in fact, has so much to offer potential players that it transcends its place as a quality fighting game to become, quite simply, one of the best games of all time, period. To understand why that is, we need to take a look at what it feels like to play Soulcalibur, which, more so than nearly any other fighting title ever released, has such a significant amount of content available that you can spend hours upon hours playing the game solo without even thinking about tackling the exquisite multiplayer components of the title. Name the last time you wanted to play a retro fighting game as a solo player against the computer for more than, say, a single playthrough. Go ahead, I'll wait. While you all figure out the answer to that inquiry, I'll start talking about what makes Soulcalibur one of the most phenomenal experiences ever released on a video game console. Before I get to that though, I have to preface our discussion by mentioning that for this podcast episode, I played the Dreamcast release of the title, which is the version of the game I have the most familiarity with, as I purchased Soulcalibur the day it was released on the home market, and still have my copy of the game over 25 years after that purchase. I recognize that the true original version of the game was released in arcades, which is itself an outstanding experience, but is also a bit less full-featured than its home counterpart. Because I wanted to re-explore the version of the game I had experienced in my youth, I decided that the Dreamcast version of the title would be the one I'd focus on for today's episode. So keep in mind that the rest of our discussion will be focused solely on that version of the game. With that out of the way, let's talk about Soulcalibur. When you first start up the game, you'll be presented with a few different gameplay modes that you could potentially tackle, including a fairly traditional arcade mode, which consists of a series of 8 fights against progressively more difficult opponents, survival mode, which is a gauntlet-styled mode where you have to try to defeat as many consecutive opponents as possible without dying, and mission mode, which attempts to add a more in-depth storyline to the Soulcalibur experience, complete with multiple battles that have various win conditions and match restrictions beyond the simple act of beating your opponent to a pulp. Of those gameplay modes, arcade and survival are the two most similar to other fighting games that have been released over the years, as your goal there is to simply outlast your opponent with the character of your choosing, and honestly, any discussion of those modes is pretty much standard fare. They're both quality additions to the game, and the arcade mode in particular has a ton of unlocks associated with it, which we'll talk about later, but from a general gameplay perspective, I don't know that there's anything particularly exciting to talk about. More exciting is Soulcalibur's Mission Mode, which you can think of as the main single-player mode in the game. In Mission Mode, you'll be presented with a series of different battles, arenas, and fight conditions, all of which need to be unlocked in order to progress through the game's story. By default, when you first start Mission Mode, you'll have access to a single stage, which is effectively a set of training battles against the Edgemaster, a fighter who has achieved mastery with every single weapon in the game. These early stages represent a very brief tutorial, where you'll be introduced to the general gameplay mechanics prevalent in the title, and learn how to actually fight the opponents you'll eventually encounter as you play the game. While these tutorial battles are all super simple, they do serve a critical purpose, which is to give you your first exposure to the game's unique combat system, which unlike nearly every other one-on-one fighting title, is entirely weapon-based. Meaning, the concept of hand-to-hand combat isn't even a consideration in Soulcalibur, and that one change does more to change the feeling of the game than pretty much any other aspect of the title's design. Rather than having a set of similarly skilled martial artists who may have different fighting styles, in Soulcalibur, you have a set of fighters that not only have distinct styles, whether focused on speed, power, or defense, but also a variety of weapons that dramatically impact how you play the game. As an example, let's say you choose a fighter like Kilik, whose weapon of choice is a super long wooden staff. Attacking with Kilik is all about using your extended range to your advantage, and more so than a bunch of other fighters, you'll be able to fire off attacks at distances that other fighters simply cannot match, a definitive advantage. Unless your opponent dodges one of your longer range attacks, which might let him or her close the distance between you and unleash their own volley of attacks. Or let's say you pick a Nunchaku-based fighter like Maxi. He doesn't have nearly the range of Kilik, but if he gets close to you, he can combo together a string of blindingly fast attacks that will make you wonder whether each attack is coming from here, there, or literally everywhere, simply because of how rapidly his moves end up hitting you. There are 10 base characters included in the game, along with 9 additional unlockable characters, and each and every one of them feels unique to play and offers their own strengths and weaknesses to learn and utilize in battle. For anyone who may be curious, I am 100% a Mitsurugi main, and have been ever since Soulcalibur originally released. While I've dabbled with other characters throughout the years, and just recently played a bunch of other characters during my play sessions in preparation for this podcast episode, Mitsurugi is my guy, and I will fight anyone who suggests that any other fighter on the roster even approaches Mitsurugi's level of awesomeness. Anyway, the roster of available characters is vast, and once you find a particular fighter that gels with your personal fighting style, you'll likely develop a bond that will remain throughout the majority of your mission mode playthrough, which is surprisingly a pretty deep experience. Like I mentioned, the only set of battles unlocked at the start of the mode is a series of tutorial fights against the Edgemaster, and as you complete those battles, you'll begin to acquire points for use in the game's art gallery. These points, which you'll get for various activities throughout the game, are useful for a couple of different reasons. For one, they let you unlock various pieces of artwork, including character sketches, concept art, pre-rendered visuals, and other imagery from the art gallery, like I just mentioned. But beyond being able to enjoy the various artwork included in the game, there's an extended benefit to using points to unlock that artwork. As you unlock various pieces of art, you'll also begin to unlock other missions, game modes, costumes, stages, and numerous other items that continue to expand the scope of what you can do within the game. The art gallery itself is set up across a series of different categories of artwork, each of which have different point values required to unlock individual pieces of art. As you unlock those art entries, you'll randomly be granted some sort of additional unlock that provides new ways of playing the game, which I've got to say feels really good. There is so much unlockable content here that working your way through the art gallery gives you a constant dopamine hit of accomplishment and the feeling of unlocking something new, even if it's something as minor as a new costume for a specific character, never gets old. The level of engagement I felt as I unlocked each new feature in the game felt almost like the feeling you get hitting the jackpot on a slot machine, because you never truly know when you're going to unlock something awesome or something minor. But regardless, it all becomes insanely addicting, and you'll end up wanting to unlock everything the game offers to you, simply because it feels so good to unlock that new content. As it relates to mission mode though, one of the key aspects of the art gallery is the ability to unlock new missions and battles, which will oftentimes take place in new stages across the game map and will routinely introduce new characters for you to do battle with. Each of those missions are accompanied by a short text-based story that helps provide some context around why you're about to take on the battle you find yourself in, and perhaps most interestingly, also provides a series of conditions with which each battle will be fought. Which means, as you play the game's mission mode, you're not simply fighting different enemies across various stages as a series of one-on-one fights. You're fighting different enemies across various stages as a series of incredibly different feeling fights, each of which may require a different strategy in order to be successful. As an example, one set of fights might take place on a stage where quicksand impedes your movement, requiring you to run in order to escape the effects of the environmental obstacle. Another set of fights might require you to dispatch 3 enemies in rapid succession while fighting in an arena where getting too close to the edge of the screen makes you explode into the air and lose a chunk of your life. Another set of fights might take place in a coliseum, where you can progress through a series of different fights only if you decide to gamble the points you've acquired while at the coliseum. You could potentially double your winnings with each successful encounter, but lose one time, and all of your winnings will go up in smoke. Or you may face a fight where your opponent won't take any damage, and you'll instead be forced to knock your enemy off of the stage in order to emerge victorious. There's even a stage that turns a traditional 3D battlefield into a 2-dimensional side-scrolling kind of stage, which I've got to say was insanely inventive. I have never seen such variety at play in any other fighting game, period, and all of these different match variations make every single battle feel distinct and engaging, even if you might be fighting the same opponents in various stages. This level of engagement and gameplay diversity, coupled with the sheer amount of unlockable content and combined with the insanely smooth fighting mechanics, creates an intoxicating mix that makes Soulcalibur feel better than nearly any other fighting game I've ever played, and even beyond that, makes the game more fun than the majority of games I've played throughout my lifetime. It's not hyperbole to suggest that Soulcalibur transcends its place as a mere fighting game, and as we've talked about so far, one of the major reasons it does that is because of how awesome the game's mission mode is. But to suggest that mission mode is the only reason why the game feels so awesome to play would be to discount the main gameplay mechanics that make Soulcalibur the outstanding experience it is. And here, we need to talk about the fighting system that's included with the game, which, like I mentioned a little bit ago, is entirely weapon-based. Simply adding weapons to the traditional fighting game gameplay loop is so profoundly amazing that it almost immediately makes Soulcalibur feel light years beyond most fighting titles. And the reason for that is, the combat system in Soulcalibur is some of the most expertly crafted fighting mechanics I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing. To understand why that is, we need to talk about traditional fighting games and how they occasionally may be a bit challenging to learn, at least with any degree of true expertise. I've mentioned it before, but just to refresh everyone's memory, I am not a competitive fighting game aficionado. Sure, I enjoy tournament fighters as much as the next guy, but I would never rank myself as an expert player, and oftentimes my main strategy involves picking a character who most closely matches my own fighting style, learning a subset of moves and combos, and then attempting to string those moves and combos together in one-on-one combat, oftentimes unsuccessfully, but as long as the overall experience is fun, it doesn't matter if I'm personally not quite as skilled as my opponents. My general approach is to mix some degree of actual combo and moveset knowledge with a scant mix of button mashing, which might not be the most refined way to enter a battle, but does provide me with the most fun way for me, as a casual fighting game player, to experience one-on-one combat. Many fighting games offer a fair number of different moves and combos for each character, and a lot of times, those moves require a series of extensive inputs in order to execute them successfully. But rarely do those combo moves and inputs feel like they are truly aligned with one another. As an example, let's say your character has a move that allows them to perform a bicycle kick, followed by a leg sweep. In most fighting games, you'll have some series of inputs that correspond to that combo move, and for the sake of our argument, let's say the input commands are right, kick, down, kick. That string of inputs, while simple enough to memorize, doesn't really translate directly into the action that accompanies those inputs. Sure, you can sort of see the translation of pressing towards an opponent and kicking as being the setup for a rising bicycle kick, and pressing down and kick does correspond logically with the crouching leg sweep, but I don't know that I'd call the entire sequence of inputs entirely intuitive. For a fighting game veteran, yeah, it makes sense, but as a more casual player, the translation isn't really there. Soulcalibur, by contrast, has designed its fighting game system such that every move, combo, and direction you press on your controller makes an action take place with your fighter that 100% makes sense given the button inputs you just entered, meaning the feeling of you actually controlling your fighter goes well beyond simply memorizing what buttons and key presses to execute. You feel like your actions are actually reflected on the screen in your fighter's attacks, which is a subtle difference, but is one that immediately makes you feel more heavily invested in the outcome of each fight you encounter. The feeling of truly having control over every movement of your fighter is simply amazing, and speaking as a more casual tournament fighter player, this is a feeling I have almost never felt with other similar fighting titles. What this ends up meaning is that the traditional gap that exists between expert players who study a character's entire move list and a more casual player who may just want to press directions and attacks to see what happens is dramatically reduced. And because of how dynamic each fight plays out on the screen, every single fight you participate in feels like a choreographed ballet of destruction that could just as easily have been included in an over-the-top martial arts film as opposed to a simple arcade-centric fighting game. This also helps to reduce the barrier to entry for new players, as it won't take you long before you get a handle on the game's controls and become surprisingly effective in combat. While there is still an incredibly high skill ceiling for dedicated players, the fact that new and casual players alike can feel like they're pulling off some really impressive maneuvers despite not truly understanding every move available to their character makes Soulcalibur more approachable than any other fighting game I have ever played. And that's not even to mention all of the other modes in the game, and all of the different unlocks you can accomplish as you play the game, all of which serve to make Soulcalibur a never-ending stream of fun, excitement, and endorphins, so much so that you may play the game for hours on end, only to have it feel like you've been playing for 30 minutes. Even playing the high difficulty challenge missions that unlock after quote-unquote beating the mission mode remain insanely fun, and somehow the computer-controlled opponents in Soulcalibur avoid the common pitfall that other tournament fighters encounter, which is overly tuned artificial intelligence that makes the single-player experience a frustration-filled experience. Think about the early iterations of Mortal Kombat, where computer-controlled opponents would literally read a player's input and respond with their own omniscient counterattacks. Those games, especially the arcade versions, were brutally difficult, so much so that the only time you'd ever willingly play the single-player modes in the game would be if you didn't have a human friend or enemy to compete against. This is not the case at all with Soulcalibur, and the game is designed in such a way that both single-player and multiplayer remain compelling, each for their own reasons. I have almost never played a fighting game where I wanted to play the single-player modes as much as I did here. And even beyond the act of unlocking different characters, stages, and other content for later use, I simply had fun playing the game, which was almost universally, and despite some difficult encounters, a truly frustration-free experience. I don't remember the last time I felt like a game approached this degree of perfection, but Soulcalibur, certainly more so than any other fighting title that I've played, definitely gets pretty darn close. We're going to talk more about why I believe Soulcalibur is one of the best games of all time in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Soulcalibur for the Sega Dreamcast, the back of the box says Soulcalibur. This is a tale of souls and swords, transcending the world and all its history, told for all eternity. The greatest weapons-based fighter returns, this time on Sega Dreamcast. Soulcalibur unleashes incredible graphics, fantastic fighters, and combos so amazing they'll make your head spin. Soulcalibur, the ultimate fighting game. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the jewel case, and I've got to say, yep, this one sells me. Although I will say, there's not a whole heck of a lot of description here, so if I didn't already know that this was a 3D fighting game and see the graphics on the back of the box and know about the arcade game, I don't know that it would have totally sold me without that pre-existing knowledge. The graphics on the back of the box look great. The overall text, not really all that descriptive. It's kind of generic because anybody can really put something in there about how their fighting game is the best fighting game in the world and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know that the text was as good as it could have been, but at the same time, this is a fighting game, so I wouldn't expect there to be a ton of additional description on the back of the box. For what it is, it's fine, it works, and it worked well enough for me to buy Soulcalibur when it first came out back in 1999. Anyway, we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Soulcalibur are nothing short of amazing, and I still recall how it felt to fire the game up on my Dreamcast back when I was younger. I had never seen a home console game look as good as Soulcalibur did, and for the first time ever, the home version of the game looked dramatically better than its arcade counterpart, an accomplishment that even in the late 90s felt like true technical wizardry. If you look at the graphics from a more modern perspective, though, you will of course notice that the visuals aren't quite as high quality as modern releases. And sure, each stage doesn't have quite the same level of detail as the photorealistic high-definition visuals that we're used to today. But you know what? It doesn't even matter, because Soulcalibur continues to look phenomenal even today, with a style that is absolutely perfect and exceeds most other titles released from around the same time in history, not to mention titles released after Soulcalibur came out. Everything about Soulcalibur's visual environment screams quality. From the varied and unique character designs, to the alternate costumes that add some visual flair to each character's look, to the incredibly diverse stages, some of which are rendered at different times of the day and night, to the animations, all of which are incredibly fluid and ultra-lifelike. Every aspect of the game's visuals feels like it was crafted by a team of expert artists who truly understood what it took to deliver a high-quality, visually appealing fighting game experience. And there isn't a single thing I would change about the game's visuals. From my perspective, Soulcalibur looks as good as it ever has, and even in comparison to some modern titles, still holds its own. Truly impressive work by the art team. Moving on to the sound and music. Much like the game's visuals, the music in Soulcalibur is outstanding, with every single stage and screen having music that perfectly captures the feeling of going on a swashbuckling, action-oriented adventure, and I loved every single song in the game. Seriously, there's not a single track here that felt out of place or in any way lesser than the others. Every song in the game is perfect, and perfectly matches the environment or screen on which it plays. A number of these songs have lived rent-free in my head for the last 25 years, and playing through the game again recently reminded me of exactly why that was. The music here is a crowning achievement in audio composition, and is something that, from my perspective, is amazing to listen to. Sound effects, meanwhile, are all phenomenal as well, with every clang of the various swords, staves, and other weaponry being reflected with pitch-perfect sounds that capture your attention and never let go. One of the main reasons why the sound effects here are so impactful is because of the fact that the game's combat is entirely weapons-based, which gave the sound team an opportunity to create more engaging sound effects than what you might see in other fighting games that have to rely solely on the sound of fists meeting faces. That's not to say that other hand-to-hand combat titles have poor sound effects, and in fact, there are a number of other fighting titles that sound equally amazing. It's just that the inclusion of weaponry in Soulcalibur helps to paint a different soundscape than your traditional fist and foot-based fighting game, and I, for one, loved how the game sounded. Beyond the sound effects and the music, there's also voice acting included in the game, all of which retains the Japanese original voice work that Soulcalibur originally featured when it was first created. And I've got to say, even though I don't understand a word of Japanese, all of the voice work here was stellar, and when combined with the music and sound effects, served to engross me even more as I played the game. Seriously, all of the audio here is so good that it's hard to talk about without sounding like I'm simply spewing a ton of pretty and effusive praise, but the fact is, in this instance, that praise is 100% warranted. Moving on to the narrative and story, the main narrative for Soulcalibur involves the pursuit of a legendary weapon known as Soul Edge, a sword that corrupts its wielder with its evil powers. Various warriors have gathered in an attempt to retrieve that weapon to hopefully stop it from wreaking havoc on the world, or potentially use its power to become rulers themselves. Depending on which character you choose, you'll be faced with various motivations for pursuing the evil Soul Edge, and it's up to you and your chosen avatar to determine whether you're seeking Soul Edge to prevent its destructive power, or if you're looking for Soul Edge in order to use its power for your own nefarious gains. I think it's fair to say that narratives in tournament fighting games are not always the deepest of stories, and to be honest, Soulcalibur doesn't really do too much to buck that trend. I mean, sure, the mission mode provides more story-based content than most other fighting titles, and each character does have a unique and satisfying end to their personal narrative arc, which I truly appreciated. But generally speaking, you're not going to play a fighting game because of its narrative, other than if you're playing a modern NetherRealm game like the current Mortal Kombat or Injustice series, both of which feature awesome storylines and single-player campaigns. For retro and classic tournament fighters, storyline existed, but it certainly was not the focus of the experience. Which is to say, while there's more story in Soulcalibur than other contemporary fighting games, and that story is itself pretty darn good from a fighting game perspective, the main focus here remains on the gameplay and the various game modes included with the game, which honestly is exactly where the focus of a tournament fighting game should be. I appreciated the inclusion of the story here, and I don't have any complaints with how the game implemented its narrative. It's just that the narrative isn't going to win any awards for being particularly profound, which at the end of the day is perfectly fine in this context. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a fair amount about the general structure and framework for the game, but what we didn't talk about was the game's controls, and that was an intentional omission for one main reason. Talking about controls in a fighting game, which typically includes a series of combos and strung-together moves, can be a pretty deep discussion, and I do not profess at all to have a firm grasp on all of the different moves included in the game. What I can do, though, is talk about the basic game controls, all of which you'll learn to combine together to form the basis of more advanced attacks over time. Moving your character around whatever stage you may be fighting in is accomplished using either your digital pad or your left analog stick, and the movement here is executed absolutely perfectly. Unlike other 3D fighters from the time that made stepping into and out of a given scene a bit cumbersome, Soulcalibur implements what it refers to as an 8-way run system, which basically lets you run around in all directions as you move your character around a stage, imparting a degree of 3D movement that is surprisingly lacking from other 3D fighting titles. The feeling of rotating around your opponent and gracefully attacking them from behind as they don't know what the heck just happened is awesome, and the fluidity of moving around each battlefield is something other fighting titles could only hope to mimic. As you move around the battlefield, you will occasionally want to attack your opponent, and here there are several options that you can potentially use to pummel your enemy into submission. You could attack with your X button, which executes a horizontal attack, or potentially your Y button, which performs a vertical move. Or maybe you want to use your B button, which lets you throw a kick. Those 3 different attack types between horizontal and vertical strikes and your kick are what form the basis of the entire fighting game system, and the game does an insanely good job of letting you combine those simple strikes with other movements and maneuvers to create some really impressive combinations of moves, some of which are absolutely devastating to your opponent. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to go into how deep the moves and various combinations can get, because that's a discussion I'm not truly equipped to tackle. But what I can say is that the way these simple strikes are combined into other moves all feel entirely intuitive, even from the perspective of a more casual fighting game player. There is a ton of depth to the fighting system and its related controls, though that depth does not prevent more casual players from feeling like they too are expert fighters, which is a balancing act that not many fighting games can achieve. The other main aspect of the game's fighting system is the ability to block, which you can accomplish by either holding your A button or timing an A button press combined with the directional input with your opponent's attack. Simply holding the A button will execute a normal standard block, while pressing A plus a direction will attempt to execute a parry-type maneuver, which is so amazing to pull off in the middle of a fight that you may break out into an uncontrollable smile every time you successfully counter one of your opponent's strikes. The parry system here is truly something special, and I personally encountered several times where my opponent and I traded parries in what I can only describe as a cinematically infused weapon-based fight that looked like it was ripped right out of a Hollywood blockbuster, and I loved it. Eventually, you'll get proficient enough with the game to combine all of these controls into a series of combos and maneuvers, and you might start experimenting with some of the less obvious control mechanics as well, like attempting to execute unblockable attacks, or holding A and pressing up to allow you to jump into the air to avoid attacks focused at your lower body. But honestly, all of that muscle memory will be developed over time, simply by playing the game. I very rarely consulted the game's included move list, mainly because I was able to so successfully string together what felt like my own combos that I never felt the need to attempt to augment my attacks with the predefined combos included with the game. Like I mentioned, this is purely a casual fighter's perspective, and I appreciated the fact that the game remains approachable for newer and more casual players, while still deep enough to remain an engaging experience for more expert players. Even beyond the fighting mechanics and various gameplay modes included in the game, there's also a ton of passive content to consume as well, like the museum mode, which presents a ridiculous amount of information, animations, artwork, and other features that add what is effectively the cherry on top of an already delicious sundae. Yes, I know I may sound like a broken record, but it's true. Soulcalibur is simply that good. The bottom line here is that Soulcalibur feels amazing to play, and when you couple the quality of the fighting with all of the other modes, features, unlocks, and extras included with the game, you get a recipe for a mesmerizing and enchanting experience, and one that very clearly demonstrates how good fighting games can be if created by a team of talented individuals. And Soulcalibur, without question, is a good fighting game. So, what is our verdict on Soulcalibur? Well, when I just said that Soulcalibur is a good fighting game, I kinda lied. The fact is, Soulcalibur is an outstanding fighting game, and even more, it is so good that it transcends its genre and the time in which it was released to become a true and undeniable classic in video and computer game history. This one was never really up for debate, as Soulcalibur is very clearly worthy of a spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. And interestingly, it only takes a very short time with the game in order to reach that conclusion. The crazy thing is, the more time you spend playing Soulcalibur, the more you'll end up appreciating it, as it is one of those rare games that never loses its appeal or feels like a burden to play, even as a single-player experience. It is so expertly crafted, so deeply engaging, and so phenomenally presented that Soulcalibur is truly one of the best games of all time. And even if you personally can't stand the concept of playing a one-on-one fighting game, I urge you to give Soulcalibur a try, because it could still become one of your favorite games of all time, even if, up to this point, you've never found a fighting game you've enjoyed. This is one of those rare times where the game we're looking at is truly timeless, and Soulcalibur is certainly deserving of that classification, while also undoubtedly being deserving of its newfound spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Soulcalibur. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Sonic CD, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Sonic CD. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.